This is a painting of one of the most famous women of the 18th century. But how can what she's doing tell us about how women were viewed at this time? And how can what she's wearing help us to understand global history? I'm Amber Butchart, and I'm a fashion historian, and I'm looking at this painting of Madame de Pompadour. It was painted by François-Hubert Drouais, who was chief portrait painter at the court of Louis XV. It was painted at the end of her life. She died a month before it was finished in 1764. Now, by this point, she's an extremely well-known figure in France. We might think of this portrait as her trying to cement her legacy. She's in her apartment at the Palace of Versailles, and she's surrounded by gilded furniture, books, a mandolin, and a folio of drawings or engravings. So it's really composed to produce an image of her as a woman of culture, of learning, and enlightenment. She's basically telling us that she's an important patron of the arts and an arbiter of fine French taste. By this point in her life, she's come a long way. Madame de Pompadour was born Jeanne Antoinette Poisson. She was born into a family who had connections to wealthy financiers, but she did not come from the aristocracy. From a very young age, she was effectively groomed to catch the eye of a king. In 1741, she got married to the nephew of her mother's rich lover. She entertained artists and intellectuals at her salon, and eventually she did succeed in catching the king's attention. In 1745, she split from her husband and became the official mistress of King Louis XV. She was given the title Marquise de Pompadour. She was then known as Madame de Pompadour. Now, official mistress might seem like a really unusual title to us, but this is something that had existed in France in a less defined way really since the Middle Ages. It was a kind of semi-official position which could actually be really lucrative. It came with apartments, with estates, and a title, as well as the potential for power and influence over the king. Their sexual relationship is likely to have ended in 1751, but she retained her title and a good relationship with the king throughout her life. So firstly, what is she doing here? Now this is a tambour embroidery frame. Tambour embroidery is thought to have originated in India, and to create it, you use a hook. As you can see here, you work chain stitch with this hook. Now we know that this is something that she actually did, because in the inventory that was taken after she died, there were tambour frames and tambour hooks as well. We also have contemporary accounts that note just how important this activity was for her at this stage of her life. One of these even noted that when she was younger, she would receive guests at her toilette, basically making herself up. But from the mid-1750s, she receives guests at her embroidery frame. She's talked about as having gone from makeup to making. This is a point in the mid-18th century when embroidery is really coming to be seen as the kind of ultimate symbol of feminine refinement in many ways. It almost embodies a certain kind of virtuous femininity. At this time, it was often practiced by aristocratic women at courts, signifying this very leisured and refined lifestyle. So her switch from toilette table to tambour frame to receive people also shows that she was effectively acting out roles that were expected of women at particular stages of their life. As a younger woman and as a mistress of the king, she's expressing herself through beauty. As an older woman, she's projecting an image of being a respectable, cultured, almost matronly figure. Although I would add that she is only 41 when the painting is started, which is 4 years younger than I am now. So now we move to what she's wearing. She's wearing a more informal look than she would have worn to more public areas of the court, but it's still a very fashionable style in decorative fabric and festooned with trimmings. These trimmings were really increasingly important in fashionable French dress at this time, and there was a new developing profession of largely women who would trade in these decorative elements. We can see it's trimmed with French needle lace and these ribbons as well. Now this all really demonstrates the immense skill of French artisans. Fashion and fabric was really important for the French economy. It was a matter of national pride. So a woman of Madame de Pompadour's stature would be expected to support these industries through what she was wearing. But because of their links to the economy, fashion and textiles were incredibly political at this time. There was huge rivalry between Britain and France. Now, this manifested through military means like wars and through expanding overseas empires, but also through the trade and manufacture of fabrics. Now, what's particularly interesting about this painting is that there's an ongoing art historical debate over the fabric that this ensemble is made from. Is it silk or is it cotton? So let's investigate the case for each and the wider context of what each of those would mean. Silk was a fabric that was really associated with France, and silk manufacture in towns like Lyon created exquisite woven silks that were worn at the French court and that set fashions around the rest of Europe. So it was previously assumed that, of course, Madame de Pompadour would be wearing French silk in this portrait. If we take a close look at the fabric, which is really beautifully rendered here, it looks like the floral decoration is actually painted onto the fabric rather than being woven or embroidered. Now, there were silk manufacturers creating painted silks in France at this time, but not a huge amount. If it wasn't created in a town like Lyon, it could have been Chinese in origin, where there was a huge export market in painted silk. Chinoiserie, which means design inspired by China, was a big craze in 18th century France, and Chinese craftspeople would create items specifically adapted for European markets. So it's quite difficult to trace the provenance of these fabrics sometimes. But this would mean it's possibly not quite such a patriotic look as we might have initially thought. The other option, cotton, was also ambiguous in its patriotism, and it can tell us a huge amount about global history at this time. A contemporary account actually described the dress in the portrait as purse, which could be translated as flower-patterned cotton rather than silk. Now, for us today, cotton seems like something that has just been around forever. But in Europe, it's only really at around the time this portrait is painted that cotton starts being imported and worn in big quantities. It's mostly coming from the Indian subcontinent, where the production and the decoration of cotton fabrics is incredibly sophisticated and has by this point been going on for centuries. From the 1600s, European trading companies started bringing back these beautiful printed, painted and glazed cotton fabrics called chintz. They're usually in floral designs like we see here. They became hugely fashionable in Europe, first as furnishing and later as fashion. Now, cotton revolutionized the way people in Western Europe dressed. It was much lighter, more comfortable to wear, easier to wash than wool, and it was cheaper than silk. But it took a while to catch on and to become readily available, partly because it formed such a threat to the European trades in wool and silk. It was such an economic threat that laws were even passed that banned these cotton fabrics in many European countries. In France, this ban was lifted in 1759, just 4 years before this painting was started. And although the ban was not entirely effective, removing it did really allow the domestic industry to flourish. And even with the ban in place, Madame de Pompadour was such a fan of these fabrics that she herself is even thought to have breached the rules. In 1752, the Treasurer of France noted, "In the whole of Bellevue Chateau," which was one of her residences, "there is not a single piece of furniture that is not contraband." Now, it's important to remember that whether this was imported fabric or painted in France, it's all heavily tied in to European colonialism and enslavement at this time. If this was Indian cotton chintz, or if this was Chinese painted silk, it could have been imported to France by the French Indies Company, of which Madame de Pompadour was a patron. This was the main French overseas trading company at the time and was overseen by the king. They made enormous profits from the trade of commodities like cotton and silk, spices, tea and coffee, and they also owned enslaved people. These trading companies were really agents of empire, and they became politically involved in many of the countries that they traded with so they could protect their financial interests. It was a really incredibly extractive system. If it was cotton that was printed or painted in France, it was likely made with raw cotton from the French West Indies. This was France's colonial territories in the Caribbean, where cotton was harvested by enslaved workers. So this would have been Madame de Pompadour showing off the wealth that was generated in Europe through the labour of enslaved people trafficked from the west coast of Africa. So we can see just how political fabrics and fashions were in the 18th century through this debate about what Madame de Pompadour is wearing in this painting. Just 25 years after this painting was finished, revolution broke out in France. And part of the debate had also centred around textiles, when silk producers accused then Queen Marie Antoinette of putting them out of business due to her decision to favour cotton muslin over silk for her dresses. In the decades following the French Revolution, cotton cultivation in the Americas expanded hugely, and it displaced enormous populations of indigenous people. By the early 1800s, around 92% of raw cotton used in British textile mills alone was harvested by enslaved people on plantations in the Americas. And the British East India Company, which was instrumental in the trade of cotton chintz to Europe, eventually led to the British Raj, the colonial rule that was established in 1858. So when we look back at Madame de Pompadour in her fashionable fabric of painted silk or glazed cotton chintz, it's important to remember the ugly histories that can exist behind such beautiful things. If you're interested in learning more about art, click here or here and subscribe to the National Gallery's YouTube channel. Thank you for watching, we'll see you next time.